My name is Melanie, 33 years old, and 3 days after returning from my honeymoon, my new stepson showed up with a sleazy lawyer to kick me out of my own home. My husband stood by crying fake tears, begging me to leave temporarily to calm things down. I simply smiled, packed a small suitcase of cheap clothes, and walked out the front door. What none of them knew was that I was sitting on a $50 million trust fund left by my late husband, and they had just handed me the perfect excuse to destroy them. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart a toxic family who underestimated your worth. The deception began before we even walked down the aisle. Thomas, my 45-year-old husband, presented himself as a highly successful real estate investment CEO. He drove European sports cars, wore custom Italian suits, and insisted we live in his sprawling Manhattan penthouse. I, on the other hand, played the part of a modest, hardworking, independent financial risk assessor. I drove a practical sedan, bought my clothes off the rack, and insisted on splitting our dinner bills down the middle. I wanted a partner who valued my mind and my character, not someone hunting for a payout. My late husband had secured my future with a massive $50 million trust fund, but I kept that wealth strictly locked away and completely hidden from Thomas. Our honeymoon was my final test of his character. Thomas had tried to book a lavish trip to Bora Bora, but I insisted we take a budget-friendly road trip to a rustic cabin in the Adirondacks. I wanted to see if he could enjoy the simple things in life. He complained about the spotty Wi-Fi and the cheap diner food behind my back, but to my face he played the role of the devoted, down-to-earth husband perfectly. I actually believed I had found a man who loved me for who I was. That delusion shattered exactly 3 days after we returned to the city. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was in the master bedroom unpacking the last of my modest sweaters when the heavy front doors of the penthouse swung open without a knock. I walked into the living room to find Brandon, my 22-year-old stepson, marching across the expensive Persian rug with a smug, arrogant grin plastered across his face. Brandon was a college dropout who spent his days pretending to run a tech startup that Thomas entirely bankrolled. Right behind Brandon was Gregory, a man whose cheap cologne and poorly fitted suit immediately screamed bottom-tier lawyer. Brandon did not bother with a greeting. He walked straight up to the glass coffee table and slammed down a thick stack of legal documents. "You have exactly 2 hours to pack your trash and get out of my house," he announced, crossing his arms over his chest. I stared at him, keeping my breathing perfectly steady. "Your house?" I asked, my voice calm and even. Gregory the lawyer stepped forward, adjusting his cheap tie with a condescending smirk. "Yes, ma'am." Thomas officially transferred the deed to this penthouse, along with all of his major liquid assets, into Brandon's name 3 weeks before your wedding. You have absolutely zero legal claim to this property, and you are currently trespassing. Before I could even process the absurdity of a pre-wedding asset transfer, Brandon snatched the top document from the stack and shoved it directly into my chest. "And that is a lawsuit," he spat, his face turning red with manufactured rage. "I am suing you for $100,000 in spousal support reimbursement. You have been leeching off my dad's money since the day you met him, eating his food, living in his luxury properties, and contributing absolutely nothing to this family. I am taking it all back." The heavy front door opened again, and Thomas rushed into the living room. His tie was loosened, his hair was perfectly disheveled, and he was already putting on the performance of a lifetime. "Melanie," he gasped, rushing over to me and grabbing my shoulders with a desperate grip. His eyes were wide, and he actually managed to squeeze out a few highly convincing tears. "I am so sorry. I had no idea he was going to do this today. Brandon tricked me into signing those asset transfers. I thought I was signing tax documents for his startup. You have to believe me." I looked into the eyes of the man I had vowed to spend my life with just days prior. His grip on my shoulders was tight, his face a mask of helpless agony. "Please," Thomas begged, his voice cracking with theatrical precision. "Just pack some things and go stay with your sister for a few days. Let me handle Brandon. Let me talk some sense into him and get my lawyers to reverse this mess. If you fight him right now, he will just make it worse and drag you into court. Just lay low, and I will fix everything, I promise you." Any normal newlywed would have collapsed in hysterics right there on the living room floor. They would have cried, screamed, begged for an explanation, or demanded to call the police to fight the eviction. But my entire professional career was built on assessing financial risk and identifying fraudulent behavior. I evaluated the situation in seconds. The synchronized timing of Brandon's arrival and Thomas's incredibly convenient entrance was far too perfectly choreographed. The fake tears, the immediate push to get me out of the door without putting up a legal fight, and the ridiculous lawsuit meant to intimidate a supposedly middle-class woman. It was a complete setup. I looked at Brandon's triumphant sneer. I looked at the sleazy lawyer who was practically vibrating with excitement over bullying a woman. And I looked at my husband, the man who thought he had just successfully discarded his financially useless wife without having to split any marital assets. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice or demand answers. I simply nodded. Okay, I said, my voice eerily calm and devoid of emotion. I will pack my things. Thomas let out a loud, exaggerated breath of fake relief and kissed my forehead. Thank you for understanding, my love. I will call you tonight. I walked into the master bedroom and pulled my small rolling suitcase from the closet. I deliberately bypassed the very few expensive items I owned and packed only the cheap generic clothes I wore to maintain my middle-class disguise. 2 pairs of basic jeans, a few plain sweaters, and my standard toiletries. I zipped the bag closed, grabbed my modest handbag, and walked back out to the living room. Brandon was already standing by the minibar, pouring himself a glass of expensive whiskey to celebrate his victory over me. Do not expect to see a dime from my dad ever again, Brandon called out as I reached the front door. I paused with my hand resting on the heavy brass doorknob. I looked back at the 3 men standing in the luxurious living room, men who fully believed they had just ruined my life and left me destitute. I will see myself out, I replied, offering them a polite, chilling smile. The heavy door clicked shut securely behind me. As I stepped into the private elevator and pressed the button for the lobby, a genuine, quiet laugh escaped my lips. They thought they had just thrown a penniless woman onto the streets demanding $100,000 from someone who could barely afford rent. They had absolutely no idea that my checking account was just a prop, that I had a $50 million trust fund waiting to be unleashed, and that they had just given me the legal green light to tear their lives apart piece by piece. The rain was coming down in thick sheets by the time I stepped out of the luxury high-rise and onto the bustling Manhattan pavement. I did not bother looking back up at the penthouse. Instead, I hailed a yellow cab, tossed my cheap decoy suitcase into the trunk, and gave the driver the address to my sister Rachel's brownstone in Brooklyn. As the city lights blurred against the wet windows, my mind raced with cold, calculated clarity. Thomas and his arrogant son thought they had executed the perfect ambush. They believed I was currently sitting in the back of this taxi, sobbing, uncontrollably terrified of facing a future without a roof over my head. When the cab pulled up to the familiar tree-lined street, I paid the fare in cash and hurried up the front steps. Rachel swung the door open before I even had the chance to knock. She took one look at my drenched coat and the small suitcase in my hand, and her eyes flashed with fierce protectiveness. She immediately pulled me inside out of the cold. Jamal, her husband, walked out of the kitchen wiping his hands on a dish towel. Jamal was a brilliant African-American cybersecurity expert who had spent years working high-level corporate defense before starting his own consulting firm. He took my wet coat and guided me into their warm, brightly lit kitchen. Rachel poured me a cup of hot tea while I sat at the island, finally allowing myself to take a deep, steadying breath. I did not cry. I simply looked at the 2 people I trusted most in the world and told them exactly what had transpired in the penthouse just an hour prior. I recounted Brandon slamming the frivolous lawsuit on the table. I detailed the completely absurd claim that Thomas had signed over all his assets 3 weeks before our wedding. And I described Thomas putting on a theatrical display of fake tears, pretending to be a helpless victim of his own son's machinations. Rachel paced the hardwood floor of the kitchen, her hands balled into fists. She was furious. She wanted to drive straight back to Manhattan and publicly shame Thomas for tossing her sister onto the streets like garbage. Jamal remained quiet, his analytical mind already processing the legal and digital implications of what I had just shared. You need to understand why I let this happen, I told them, keeping my voice perfectly level. I explained the real reason I had hidden my wealth. My late husband had been a quiet genius in commercial logistics. When he passed away unexpectedly, he left me a blind trust worth exactly $50 million. He wanted me to be safe, secure, and completely independent. But carrying that kind of wealth changes how the world looks at you. Men suddenly become overly charming, intentions become murky. I wanted to be loved for my mind, my humor, and my character. I wanted a true partnership. When I met Thomas, he seemed like the perfect match. He presented himself as a wealthy, self-made man who did not need anyone else's money. By playing the role of a modest financial risk assessor who lived paycheck to paycheck, I thought I had leveled the playing field. I thought I had found a man whose affection was genuine. Tonight proved that his entire persona was a carefully constructed mirage. Jamal pulled his laptop from his home office and set it on the kitchen island. Melanie, if they are orchestrating a fake eviction and throwing legal documents in your face, we cannot take any chances with your digital security, he said, his tone shifting into absolute professional focus. Thomas might have installed tracking software on your phone, or he might try to lock you out of your email accounts to isolate you further. I need to run a full diagnostic on your devices right now. I handed over my phone and gave him the passwords to my personal accounts. I told him to check the modest checking account I used for my daily expenses. It was the only account Thomas knew about. I kept exactly $12,000 in it to pay for groceries, split utility bills, and maintain my frugal cover story. It was meant to look like the humble life savings of an everyday working woman. Jamal's fingers flew across his keyboard, running security protocols and bypassing the standard login screens to check my banking activity securely. For a few moments, the only sound in the kitchen was the steady tapping of his keys and the rain lashing against the window panes. Suddenly, Jamal stopped typing. He leaned closer to the screen, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. He ran the query a second time. Melanie, he said, his voice dropping to a low, serious register. You need to look at this. Rachel stopped pacing and moved to stand behind his chair. I walked around the kitchen island and stared at the glowing monitor. My personal checking account was displayed on the screen. The balance was zero. A cold wave of realization washed over me. I scanned the transaction history. Earlier that morning, while I was unpacking from our honeymoon, exactly $12,000 had been electronically transferred to an external holding account, registered under Thomas's name. How did he bypass your security prompts? Rachel asked, her voice rising in disbelief. He cannot just empty your personal bank account without authorization. He did not hack it, Jamal explained, pointing to a digital signature attached to the wire transfer. He used a marital expense authorization form. The memory clicked into place instantly. 2 weeks before the wedding, Thomas had playfully brought a stack of paperwork into the living room over a glass of wine. He claimed it was standard HR paperwork for his company's health insurance and a few joint marital expense forms so we could seamlessly share household bills. He had framed it as a romantic gesture of trust. I had skimmed them and signed, trusting my future husband. I used that authorization to quietly siphon off every last penny he thought I owned. He did not just want to evict me to avoid splitting assets. He wanted to drain me completely dry. In his mind, he had just stolen my entire life savings. He believed he was leaving me entirely destitute, forcing me to walk out into the rain with absolutely nothing to my name but the cheap clothes in my suitcase. He wanted to break me financially, so I could never afford a lawyer to fight his fake eviction or Brandon's ridiculous lawsuit. It was a predatory, calculated move designed to leave me ruined. I stared at the zero balance on the screen. A strange, dangerous sense of calm settled over my entire body. Thomas thought he had successfully gutted a defenseless woman. He thought he held all the power. I looked up at Jamal and Rachel, and a sharp smile formed on my face. Jamal, I said, my tone shifting into the calculating precision of a risk assessor preparing for war. If Thomas is desperate enough to steal $12,000 from his new wife, he is not the wealthy real estate mogul he claims to be. I need you to dig into his public records, find out who really owns that penthouse, and trace where my stolen money went. We are going to find out exactly what he is hiding. Jamal held my gaze for a fraction of a second before a sharp, determined nod broke the silence in the kitchen. He did not ask unnecessary questions or waste time offering empty platitudes. He simply turned back to his monitors, his fingers resuming their dance across the keyboard with a newfound lethal intensity. Jamal was not just a tech enthusiast. He was a highly sought-after cybersecurity expert who built his reputation defending multinational corporations from sophisticated digital threats. If Thomas had left even a microscopic digital footprint while executing his theft, Jamal would inevitably uncover it. Rachel wrapped a thick, warm blanket tightly around my shoulders, her expression a potent mixture of simmering rage and fierce sisterly devotion. She gently guided me away from the kitchen island, insisting I change out of my damp clothes and take a moment to collect myself. I followed her down the short hallway to the guest room. This room in their Brooklyn brownstone had always been a sanctuary for me, a stark contrast to the sterile, sprawling penthouse I had just been unceremoniously thrown out of. I closed the bedroom door and sat on the edge of the plush bed, listening to the muffled rhythmic sounds of Jamal typing in the adjacent room. The quiet isolation of the guest room allowed the massive gravity of the evening to finally settle around me. Thomas honestly believed he had broken me. He fully believed his meticulously planned ambush had left me destitute, humiliated, and desperate. He was wrong on every conceivable level. My mind drifted to Michael, my late husband. Michael was a quiet titan in the world of commercial logistics, a man who built a vast empire through sheer grit, brilliant calculations, and unparalleled foresight. When a sudden illness took him from me far too soon, I was entirely shattered. I was also left as the sole beneficiary of a $50 million blind trust. $50 million is not just money. It is a reality-distorting force. It changes the gravitational pull of every room you enter. When Michael passed, I saw the absolute worst elements of human nature come crawling out of the woodwork. I saw fake sympathy masking greedy calculations. I endured unsolicited investment pitches from distant relatives and acquaintances who had not bothered to speak to me in a decade. It deeply disgusted me. I made a solemn vow to myself that my wealth would remain an impenetrable secret until I found a man whose character proved completely incorruptible. I hired one of the most ruthless wealth managers in New York to bury the trust behind heavy layers of anonymous corporate shells. I purposefully adopted the persona of an everyday financial risk assessor, clipping coupons, buying clothes off the clearance rack, and driving a practical sedan. I wanted a partner who desired me for my intellect, my sharp humor, and my unwavering loyalty. I wanted someone who would stand by my side through the absolute worst storms. When Thomas entered my life, he played the part of a successful self-made man who had zero interest in my modest paycheck. His facade had been a masterclass in manipulation. He never flaunted his supposed wealth in a tacky manner, but rather deployed it strategically to create an illusion of unshakable security. The expensive dinners he insisted on paying for the casual mentions of offshore accounts, the pristine penthouse overlooking the city skyline. It was all meticulously designed to disarm me. I had analyzed thousands of corporate financial profiles in my career, detecting fraud with microscopic precision. Yet I had allowed my human desire for companionship to blind me to the massive red flags sitting right across from me at the dinner table. The cruelty of his deception was breathtaking. He had bypassed my emotional defenses only to try and bleed dry the meager $12,000 he assumed was my entire life savings. I changed into dry, comfortable clothes and walked back out to the main living area. Jamal had transformed the large dining table into a digital war room. Multiple screens glowed brightly with complex lines of code, financial databases, and encrypted search queries. Rachel was pouring him a fresh cup of dark coffee, her eyes scanning the rapidly scrolling data with intense focus. I pulled up a chair right beside Jamal. I need to know absolutely everything, I told them, my voice perfectly steady and completely stripped of any lingering vulnerability. Thomas and Brandon did not execute a flawless eviction out of nowhere. Brandon has been openly hostile since the day we met, but today was entirely different. It was highly organized. It was desperate. Brandon dropping a frivolous lawsuit on the table, while Thomas magically appeared to play the tragic peacemaker, was a staged performance meant to confuse and intimidate me. I need you to bypass their public facades. We need to find out why a supposedly wealthy real estate mogul is desperate enough to steal $12,000 from his new wife. Jamal cracked his knuckles, a grim, predatory smile playing on his lips. You got it, Melanie. If Thomas moved money, he created a digital trail. I am running a deep scrub on Brandon first. That kid is wildly arrogant, and arrogant people always make sloppy mistakes online. I am going to pull the registration data for his tech startup, cross-reference it with his social media metadata, and map out his exact financial relationship with Thomas. Rachel placed a warm, reassuring hand firmly over mine. They picked the absolute wrong woman to mess with, she said fiercely, her eyes flashing with determination. We are going to tear their little house of cards to the ground. I want you to isolate the exact wire transfer. Thomas used to drain my account, I instructed, leaning over the glowing monitors. But do not alert his bank or trigger any fraud warnings yet. I want him to feel completely secure. I want him to believe his petty theft went completely unnoticed by the banking system. Once you trace the final destination of those stolen funds, start pulling the public corporate filings for his real estate firm. Look for any hidden shell companies, offshore holding accounts, and any signs of a recent liquidity crisis. Men like Thomas do not orchestrate fake evictions unless the walls are rapidly closing in on them. And Rachel interjected, her arms crossed tight against her chest. Do not forget about that arrogant little brat. He was practically vibrating with excitement when he handed you that ridiculous lawsuit. He is a key part of this entire puzzle. I nodded in complete agreement. Brandon's tech startup is a financial black hole, I told Jamal. Thomas has been funneling massive amounts of capital into it for 2 years, but they have never produced a single viable product. I highly suspect it is nothing more than a vanity project, or worse, a mechanism for illegally moving money around. Dig deeply into the startup's vendor payments and employee payroll. Let us see if Brandon is actually running a legitimate business, or just playing pretend CEO with his father's rapidly diminishing funds. I watched the bright screens reflect in Jamal's eyes as he breached the first layer of Brandon's public records. The storm outside continued to rage violently against the Brooklyn streets, but inside this brownstone, an entirely different kind of storm was brewing. Thomas thought he had cast me out into the cold, leaving me completely powerless and broken. He was about to learn the hard way that true power does not always announce itself with a loud roar. Sometimes, it operates silently from the shadows, calculating every single variable, just waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Jamal did not take his eyes off the monitor as he reached into a desk drawer and pulled out a sealed prepaid mobile phone. He slid it across the kitchen island toward me. Your current devices are severely compromised, he stated with absolute certainty. If Thomas planned this eviction with his lawyer, he absolutely anticipated you fighting back. Hand me your phone, your tablet, and the smartwatch. I am taking them completely offline right now. I unclasped the leather band from my wrist and handed over my electronics without a second thought. Jamal immediately isolated them in a signal-blocking pouch before connecting them to a closed-loop diagnostic terminal. Within minutes, his initial suspicions were validated. Hidden deep within the background processes of my phone was a sophisticated keylogger and location tracker, cleverly disguised as a routine software update. Thomas had installed it during our honeymoon while I was sleeping. He had been monitoring my private emails, tracking my physical movements, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "Hi is thorough," Rachel muttered, pouring a second cup of dark coffee and setting it beside Jamal's keyboard. But he clearly does not know who he is dealing with. "Hi knows nothing," I replied softly, my gaze fixed on the sterile glow of the screens. He saw a modest woman with a practical job and assumed I was an easy mark. Let us see exactly where my $12,000 went. Jamal cracked his knuckles again and pivoted to his primary workstation. He isolated the digital signature from the marital expense authorization form Thomas had weaponized. Watching Jamal navigate the financial web was like watching a master surgeon operate. He bypassed the initial banking firewalls by tracing the routing numbers, circumventing the standard consumer interfaces to access the raw transactional data. The stolen funds had not simply moved from my checking account into Thomas's personal savings. Instead, the money had been fractured into four smaller, inconspicuous amounts and instantly wired to a series of obscure limited liability companies. "Look at this routing architecture," Jamal said, pointing a pen at a cascading list of offshore holding accounts. "This is not how a legitimate real estate CEO manages household expenses. This is a classic obfuscation technique. He is bouncing the cash through dummy corporations to wash the origin of the funds before they reach his actual ledger." I leaned closer, my professional instincts sharpening. In my career as a risk assessor, I had dismantled complex corporate fraud structures for multinational clients. The pattern on Jamal's screen was glaringly obvious. Thomas was using a technique called layering, a desperate tactic usually employed by criminals attempting to hide illicit assets from federal auditors. "Follow the money trail to the final destination," I instructed, my voice devoid of any hesitation. "Cut through the dummy corporations. Where did the cash actually land?" Jamal ran a reverse IP trace on the holding companies, linking their tax identification numbers back to a central corporate entity. A few keystrokes later, the final destination materialized on the screen. The $12,000 had been deposited directly into the primary operating account of Vanguard Horizon Properties, the flagship company of Thomas's supposed real estate empire. But that was not the massive red flag. The red flag was the balance of that flagship corporate account. Melanie, Jamal said, his voice laced with disbelief. "Look at his corporate ledger." I stared at the numbers. Vanguard Horizon Properties, a firm Thomas constantly boasted was handling hundreds of millions in urban development, had an operating balance of barely $400 before my stolen money arrived. The $12,000 from my checking account was immediately consumed by automated withdrawals. The funds went directly toward paying past due utility bills for commercial office spaces, lingering legal retainers, and a severely delinquent premium on Thomas's luxury sports car. Rachel gasped softly behind me. "He is broke. He is completely, utterly broke." "Worse than broke," I corrected, a chilling realization washing over me. "He is drowning." A legitimate property mogul does not steal a few $1,000s from his new wife just to keep the lights on in his office. He did not evict me because Brandon demanded it. He evicted me because he is financially starving and he needed to liquidate my account without giving me the opportunity to ask questions or demand an audit. Jamal continued to dig, pulling up the public tax records and vendor contracts associated with Thomas's firm. The deeper he went, the uglier the picture became. The entire real estate empire was a hollow facade. The glamorous properties Thomas claimed to own were highly leveraged, suffocating under layers of predatory high-interest loans. He had been borrowing against properties he did not fully own to pay off older, aggressive creditors. It was a classic, catastrophic structure of financial ruin, and it was currently collapsing in real time. "High as a dead man walking," Jamal stated, pulling up a list of outstanding civil judgments against Vanguard Horizon. "He has multiple contractors suing him for unpaid labor, and his primary lenders are preparing to initiate aggressive recovery protocols. He needed you out of that penthouse because the illusion is about to shatter." I picked up the prepaid burner phone Jamal had given me. My actual devices were safely locked away, severing Thomas's ability to monitor my location or intercept my communications. He believed I was currently wandering the wet streets of Manhattan, penniless, traumatized, and completely at his mercy. He believed he had successfully stolen my life savings to buy himself a few more weeks of breathing room. He had no idea that I held $50 million in untouched, untraceable capital. He had no idea that he had just handed a seasoned financial risk assessor the exact digital roadmap to his entire fraudulent network. Keep digging into the digital footprint of his real estate empire, I told Jamal, my eyes locked on the list of Thomas's angry creditors. If Thomas is moving stolen money through dummy corporations to pay his car lease, Brandon's tech company is undoubtedly part of this laundering machine. Map out every single person Thomas owes money to. I want a complete, comprehensive list of his debts. Rachel looked at me, a fierce smile touching her lips. "What are you going to do with a list of his creditors?" "I am going to let Thomas believe he has won." "For a few more days," I replied, the ice in my voice matching the cold storm outside. I am going to let him think he successfully discarded me. And then when he least expects it, I am going to buy his entire world. Jamal took my directive as an immediate command. He minimized the windows displaying Thomas's hollow corporate accounts and opened a secure gateway into the municipal real estate databases. Rachel paced behind us, the rhythmic tap of her footsteps mirroring the rapid clatter of Jamal's keyboard. We needed to understand the exact anatomy of the lie Brandon had shoved into my hands just hours ago. Pull the deed registry for the Manhattan penthouse. I instructed, my eyes tracking the reflection of data across Jamal's glasses. I want to see the exact date Thomas supposedly transferred the property to his son. Jamal executed the search protocol, pulling up the county clerk's official property records. The screen populated with dense legal filings, tax assessments, and ownership histories. He isolated the specific block and lot number for the luxury high-rise. The results were immediate and completely undeniable. There was no deed transfer. The document Brandon had aggressively slammed onto the glass coffee table was a complete fabrication. It was a worthless piece of paper printed out to look intimidating, likely drafted by Gregory to scare a woman they assumed had no legal resources. Thomas could not legally transfer the penthouse to Brandon because Thomas did not hold a single ounce of equity in the property. "Look at this," Jamal said, his voice dropping into a low register of disbelief. He highlighted a cascading series of red flags buried in the public filings. Thomas has not made a mortgage payment on that penthouse in 14 months. I leaned closer to the monitor, reading the stark financial reality hidden behind Thomas's designer suits and expensive cologne. The property was suffocating under 3 separate massive liens. It was not a palace of a self-made titan. It was a sinking ship taking on water faster than they could bail it out. Rachel stopped pacing and stared at the screen over my shoulder. "If he has not paid the mortgage in over a year, how are they still living there?" "They are not going to be living there much longer," Jamal replied, bringing up a highly restricted legal dispatch schedule. He pointed to an active notice of default that had matured into a final judgment. "The bank is done negotiating. The foreclosure process is complete. This property is slated for immediate repossession." My breath caught in my throat as the sheer pathetic reality of their performance finally clicked into place. I checked the date on the bank's eviction mandate. County sheriffs were scheduled to arrive at the penthouse to physically lock the doors and seize the property by this coming Friday. The fake eviction was never just about stealing my $12,000 or avoiding a messy divorce. The entire theatrical display this afternoon was a desperate, panicked cover-up. Thomas knew the bank authorities were coming. He knew that by the end of the week, uniformed officers would be marching into the lobby of that high-rise to publicly throw him out. His fragile, narcissistic ego simply could not handle the humiliation of his new wife standing in the living room, watching his fake billionaire persona completely disintegrate. He could not bear the thought of me seeing him exposed as a broke, desperate fraud, being forcibly removed from a home he did not own. So he and Brandon orchestrated a preemptive strike. Brandon played the role of the ruthless, conquering stepson claiming his rightful castle. He acted like an arrogant prince screaming at me to pack my trash and get out, masking his own terror. In reality, Brandon was just a broke kid helping his broke father clear the stage before the actual authorities arrived to repossess the very floor they stood on. They needed me gone immediately, thrown out in the rain, so they could quietly pack their own bags in the dark and flee before the bank changed the locks. "It is almost sad," Rachel whispered, shaking her head in disgust. "They put on that entire dramatic show just to hide the fact that they are essentially homeless." "It is not sad," I corrected her, my voice sharp and entirely devoid of pity. "It is highly calculated emotional abuse." Thomas watched me pack a suitcase, genuinely believing I was headed for a homeless shelter, all to protect his own bruised ego. He weaponized his son to terrorize me, just to buy himself 3 days of secrecy. And that ridiculous lawsuit Brandon threatened me with was just a prop to ensure I was too frightened to fight back. Jamal brought up the specific financial institution holding the primary mortgage on the penthouse. The debt was currently sitting in a high-risk portfolio managed by a commercial bank that frequently sold off toxic assets to private equity firms. "Then you isolate the exact portfolio containing the penthouse debt?" I asked Jamal, my mind already formulating the next phase of my attack. Jamal nodded, his fingers flying across the keys to trace the bank's current asset liquidation schedules. It is sitting in a distressed debt bundle. The bank has already written it off as a massive loss. They are preparing to auction the debt to a third-party collection agency by the end of the month just to get it off their books. Perfect, I said, a dangerous absolute calm washing over me. Thomas and Brandon believed they had successfully outsmarted me. They were currently sitting in that penthouse drinking expensive whiskey. They could not afford celebrating their fake victory while waiting for the bank to inevitably kick them out. They thought their biggest problem was avoiding the county sheriffs on Friday. They had absolutely no idea that their problem was about to become infinitely worse. By faking my eviction, they had given me the perfect motive, the perfect opportunity, and the perfect cover. I was not just going to watch them lose their home. I was going to become the entity that took it from them. Jamal, keep tracking the movement of that distressed debt portfolio. I instructed, stepping back from the digital war room. We need to know exactly when it hits the market. Because when it does, I am not going to let a random collection agency buy it. I am going to buy it myself. Rachel looked at me, a mixture of awe and fierce approval lighting up her face. You are going to be his landlord. No, I corrected softly, the ice in my veins solidifying into pure relentless strategy. I am going to be his executioner. The layers of Thomas's deception were peeling back one by one, exposing a rotting core of financial desperation. But as Jamal continued to dig into the background of Brandon's tech startup, the flashing red warnings on the screen indicated that simple bank foreclosure was just the tip of a much more sinister iceberg. The real crime had not even been uncovered yet. I leaned over the kitchen island, the soft glow of the monitors reflecting off the marble countertop. My years of training as a financial risk assessor took over, sharpening my focus until the raw data on the screen was the only thing that mattered. Jamal, pull up every registered financial transaction for Brandon's tech company over the last 24 months, I commanded, my voice dropping into the clinical, detached tone I reserved for dismantling corrupt portfolios. Jamal typed a rapid sequence of commands, bypassing basic search engines to access a secured registry of state corporate filings. Brandon's company, a supposed tech innovator called Apex Dynamic Solutions, materialized on the center monitor. Rachel stared at the screen, her arms crossed tightly. What exactly are we looking for? We are looking for the lie, I replied, tracing a manicured finger down the list of recent wire transfers. Startups have a very specific metabolic rate. They burn through cash acquiring talent, renting server space, and funding research and development. If Brandon is running a legitimate technology firm, we will see a high volume of operational expenses. Jamal brought up the primary operating ledger for Apex Dynamic. The screen flooded with rows of banking data. For a moment, the room was completely silent as the sheer audacity of the fraud laid itself bare. There were no operational expenses. There were no payments to software engineers, no receipts for server hosting, and absolutely no inbound revenue from actual clients. Instead, the ledger showed a bizarre rhythmic pattern of massive round-number cash deposits originating from an obscure holding company in Delaware. The moment those massive deposits hit Brandon's startup account, they were immediately fractured and wired out. Look at the outgoing payment destinations, Jamal said, pointing his pen at the screen, his tone laced with absolute disgust. The funds were flowing directly to high-end bespoke tailors, luxury automotive leasing agencies, exclusive country clubs, and Thomas's personal credit lines. It was a glorified piggy bank. Brandon was not running a tech startup. He was running a sophisticated financial washing machine. And right there, buried at the bottom of the most recent transactions, was my missing $12,000. Thomas had siphoned it from my modest checking account and immediately dumped it into Brandon's fake company to cover a severely delinquent payroll tax penalty. They are laundering money, Rachel whispered, the color draining slightly from her face. They are washing Thomas's cash through Brandon's fake business to avoid taxes. It is worse than tax evasion, I corrected her, my mind connecting the final dots of the financial anatomy. Thomas does not have his own cash to launder. We already proved his real estate firm is bankrupt. He is washing someone else's money. Jamal cross-referenced that anonymous Delaware holding company with Vanguard Horizon's public security offerings. Did Thomas issue any corporate bonds recently? Jamal's fingers flew across the keyboard. He tapped into the municipal securities database, pulling up the debt instruments tied to Thomas's primary real estate firm. A massive file loaded onto the screen stamped with official regulatory seals. Bingo, Jamal said, tapping the monitor. 2 years ago, Vanguard Horizon issued $25 million in corporate bonds to a private syndicate of investors. The prospectus claimed the capital was secured to develop a massive commercial retail complex in Lower Manhattan. Pull the property records for that specific commercial development. I ordered, the ice in my veins solidifying. A few keystrokes later, a satellite image of the Manhattan address appeared on the screen. It was not a towering commercial complex. It was a dilapidated chain-link fenced parking lot covered in overgrown weeds and discarded trash. Construction had never even begun. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with terrifying clarity. Thomas had sold $25 million in worthless corporate bonds to private investors, promising them high-yield returns on a building that did not exist. I took that $25 million, funneled it into the Delaware holding company, and then systematically washed it through Brandon's fake tech startup under the guise of consulting fees and software licensing. They had spent the last 2 years living like absolute kings on stolen investor capital. But corporate bonds have maturity dates. Check the maturity schedule on those bonds, I told Jamal, my heart beating in a slow, steady rhythm. Jamal scrolled down the digital prospectus. The first major wave of investor payouts matured exactly 2 weeks ago. Thomas has defaulted, I said, leaning back from the monitors, the entire scope of their desperation finally making perfect sense. He stole $25 million, blew it all on luxury cars, expensive suits, and a fake billionaire lifestyle, and now the investors are demanding their returns. He is completely empty-handed. Rachel covered her mouth with her hand. This is not just a foreclosure. This is a massive federal crime. They are committing wire fraud, securities fraud, and money laundering. They are looking at 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Jamal added, his voice grim. The investors are undoubtedly preparing to audit Vanguard Horizon. The Securities and Exchange Commission is probably already circling the waters. That is why they are acting like trapped animals. The fake eviction this afternoon was not just about hiding a bank foreclosure from me. It was the frantic, uncoordinated thrashing of 2 men who knew the federal authorities were about to kick down their door. They were terrified, backed into a corner, and lashing out at the easiest target they could find to buy themselves a momentary sense of control. They threw me out into the rain because they needed to clear the blast radius of their own impending destruction. I stared at the glowing monitors, absorbing the sheer magnitude of their criminality. Thomas had played the part of a loving, protective husband while quietly preparing to leave me destitute. Brandon had screamed in my face, acting like an untouchable corporate prince, while his entire existence was funded by stolen money. They thought they were the apex predators in this scenario. They had no idea. They had just handed a veteran financial risk assessor the exact blueprints to their federal indictment. The data on Jamal's screen was not just proof of their betrayal. It was the weapon I was going to use to bury them both. Jamal continued to filter through the massive data dump, isolating the specific corporate structures of the Delaware holding company. The deeper we went into the anatomy of the fraud, a new, highly disturbing pattern began to emerge. The $25 million in stolen investor capital had not just been washed through Brandon's startup. It had been meticulously routed through a single primary executive account before being dispersed. Pull the incorporation documents for that Delaware shell company, I told Jamal, pointing to a specific node on his digital map. I want to see the names of the board of directors. Thomas is arrogant, but he is not stupid enough to put his own name on a federal money laundering vehicle. Jamal bypassed the state registry's paywall, downloading the raw PDF of the company's executive charter. The document materialized on the center screen. My eyes scanned the black and white text, scrolling past the registered agent details and the obscure corporate mailing address. When I reached the section listing the primary corporate officers, the breath completely left my lungs. Rachel leaned in, her eyes widening in sheer horror. She stared at the monitor, her voice trembling. Is that your signature? It was my name. Right there, permanently inked on state and federal tax filings. I was listed as the sole proprietor, the primary shareholder, and the acting chief executive officer of the fraudulent shell company. Below my printed name was my exact, undeniably authentic signature. The kitchen went dead silent. The sound of the storm outside seemed to fade away, replaced by a deafening ringing in my ears. My entire professional life was dedicated to analyzing financial risk, and yet I had just discovered that I was the largest liability in a massive federal crime. Jamal's hands hovered over his keyboard, frozen in disbelief. "He framed you," Jamal stated, the dark realization settling over the room like a heavy shroud. "He did not just use you for your $12,000. He built this entire financial bomb specifically to detonate in your hands." I closed my eyes, letting the memory of that evening 2 weeks before our wedding play back with chilling clarity. Thomas had poured me a glass of expensive red wine. He had sat beside me on the plush sofa in the penthouse, laughing and joking about how tedious corporate bureaucracy was. He had handed me a thick stack of papers claiming they were standard marital tax disclosures and HR forms for his health insurance policies. He had pointed to the little yellow sticky notes indicating where I needed to sign. I had trusted the man I was about to marry. I had signed my name on the dotted line without reading the dense legal jargon hidden beneath the top pages. With a few strokes of a pen, I had not just authorized him to drain my checking account. I had legally appointed myself as the head of a massive illegal money laundering syndicate. "This completely changes the motive of the eviction," I said, opening my eyes. My voice was no longer just cold, it was lethal. The fake eviction this afternoon was not just about hiding a bank foreclosure. It was the final critical step in a premeditated federal frame-up. Rachel looked confused, panic edging into her features. "What do you mean? Why throw you out if they need you to take the fall?" "Because of the narrative." I explained the pieces of their sinister psychological trap, snapping together perfectly in my mind. "Think about how this looks to a Securities and Exchange Commission auditor or an FBI financial crimes unit. The feds are about to raid that penthouse looking for the $25 million. When they kick down the door, they will not find the CEO of the shell company. They will find Thomas, the supposedly heartbroken, betrayed husband." Jamal caught on immediately, his eyes widening. "And Thomas will tell the feds that his wife suddenly packed her bags and fled the apartment just days after the wedding." "Exactly," I confirmed. Brandon's ridiculous lawsuit for $100,000 in spousal support was not a temper tantrum. It was a calculated legal maneuver to establish a documented public paper trail of severe marital discord. They created a highly visible conflict so that when the authorities come looking for the stolen millions, Thomas can claim that his deceptive gold-digging wife stole the investor capital, drained her own checking account to cover her tracks, and vanished into thin air. Thomas was going to hand the FBI my name on a silver platter. He was going to use my disappearance as absolute proof of my guilt. He and Brandon would play the innocent, naive victims who had been conned by a masterful female grifter. They were actively preparing to send me to a federal penitentiary for 20 years so they could walk away clean. The sheer breathtaking evil of the setup was almost impressive. Thomas had spent months cultivating a romance, planning a wedding, and playing the perfect partner, all while meticulously sizing me up for a prison uniform. He viewed my practical lifestyle, my independence, and my lack of a high-profile family as the perfect vulnerabilities. He thought I was an isolated middle-class woman who would crumble under the weight of a federal indictment. He assumed I would end up sitting in a cold interrogation room, sobbing, confused, and completely unable to afford a defense attorney to prove my innocence. Rachel grabbed my arm, her grip tight. "We are going to the police right now. We are taking this data to the FBI before Thomas has the chance to spin his story." "No," I replied, my gaze locked on my forged signature glowing on the monitor. "If we go to the authorities now, Thomas will simply claim ignorance. He will hire a high-priced defense attorney and drag this out in court for years, blaming everything on Brandon or some rogue accountant. He might even successfully cast enough reasonable doubt to escape prison time. That is unacceptable." Jamal looked at me, a fierce, calculating gleam in his eye. "Then how do we trap him?" "We let him play his hand," I said softly. "We let him and Brandon commit fully to their lie. To destroy a man like Thomas, you do not just expose his crimes. You let him build his own gallows and then you hand him the rope. We have the digital proof that I am the scapegoat. Now I need to make sure that when this bomb detonates, Thomas is holding it right against his chest." The morning light filtering into Rachel's kitchen felt entirely disconnected from the digital war we were waging. Jamal had barely slept. His primary workstation remained alive with automated tracking alerts he had established around my personal data. I was pouring my first cup of black coffee when a sharp synthetic chime echoed through the room. At exactly 7 in the morning, the first alarm triggered. Brandon had made his move. He did not just post a petty emotional complaint on his personal social media profile. He weaponized the digital marketing infrastructure of his fraudulent tech startup to launch a highly coordinated vicious smear campaign. Jamal quickly pulled up a prominent local online tabloid known for catering to the Manhattan real estate and business elite. There, splashed across the digital front page, was a supposedly exclusive interview with my stepson. The headline was sickeningly dramatic. Heartbreak and betrayal. A son speaks out on the gold digger who destroyed his family. In the article, Brandon spun a masterful, horrifying web of absolute fiction. He claimed I had manipulated my way into his father's life using calculated affection. He stated I had aggressively isolated Thomas from his lifelong friends, created a toxic household dynamic, and ruthlessly drained their joint accounts before vanishing into the night when times got tough. Brandon painted his father as a devastated, overly trusting man who had simply wanted a second chance at love. According to the article, Thomas was currently entirely shattered, left financially and emotionally ruined by a ruthless, predatory con artist. It was not just a single hit piece. Brandon unleashed a coordinated barrage across every major social media platform. Jamal's monitors lit up as he traced the digital footprint of the attack. Brandon was utilizing his startup's dormant bot network to artificially inflate engagement, pushing the false narrative into trending topics within our local business community. Fake accounts and paid amplifiers were sharing the article by the thousands. The posts featured carefully cropped photos from our wedding, accompanied by lengthy fabricated captions warning other wealthy men about my supposed predatory tactics. Brandon even went so far as to claim I had explicitly demanded the penthouse deed during a violent screaming match. He framed my fake eviction as me throwing a massive tantrum and storming out when his brave father finally put his foot down against my relentless greed. Rachel read the articles over my shoulder, her grip tightening on her coffee mug until her knuckles turned white. She was visibly vibrating with rage. She pulled her phone from her pocket, her thumbs hovering over the screen ready to draft a blistering defense. She wanted to tell the world that Thomas was actually a broke, fraudulent criminal who had just stolen her sister's money. I reached out and gently pushed her hand down. "Do not engage," I told her, my voice eerily calm against the backdrop of the digital onslaught. "Do not leave a single comment. Do not try to defend me." Rachel looked at me as if I had lost my mind. "Melanie, they are destroying your reputation in real time. People are actually believing this garbage. You cannot just sit here and let them paint you as a criminal." I turned my gaze back to the monitors, watching the fake outrage pour in from anonymous accounts. I am a criminal in their story. I explained the cold logic of my risk assessment background taking over. That is the entire point of this performance. This smear campaign is not about a bruised ego or petty revenge. It is the crucial public foundation of their federal scapegoat strategy. I walked around the kitchen island, pointing to the specific phrasing Brandon used in the tabloid interview. Look at the words he is using. He keeps emphasizing that I controlled the finances. He keeps mentioning that I vanished and abandoned them. They are actively planting the seeds for the authorities. When the Securities and Exchange Commission eventually kicks down the door of that penthouse, looking for the missing $25 million, Thomas needs a documented, public trail showing that he is a victim. Jamal nodded slowly, understanding the sinister architecture of their plan. "They are trying to try you in the court of public opinion before the federal indictment even drops," he said. "They want the narrative firmly established so that when they hand your name over to the FBI, the investigators already have a preconceived bias against you." "Exactly," I confirmed. "If we fight back online now, we will alert them that we are watching and preparing. We will show our hand." Let Brandon scream into the digital void. Let him deploy every bot and fake account he has. Every cruel comment, every shared post, every sensationalized headline is another brick in the trap they are building for themselves. Thomas was purposefully staying quiet, letting his son play the aggressive attack dog while he maintained the illusion of the wounded, silent victim. It was a classic, highly manipulative dynamic. They were committing to the lie with such aggressive arrogance that there would be absolutely no way for them to backpedal when the truth finally dropped. Jamal pulled up an entirely new set of tracking algorithms, capturing the IP addresses of every fake account pushing the narrative. He was logging every single piece of digital defamation, archiving the smear campaign, to use against them in a court of law. His ability to trace their hostility back to its exact source code provided a comforting layer of security. I stood in the safety of my sister's home, watching my professional and personal credibility take a severe, coordinated beating. My phone, safely isolated in Jamal's signal-blocking pouch, was undoubtedly flooded with messages from confused acquaintances and angry onlookers. The initial sting of the character assassination was sharp, but the strategic advantage it handed me was entirely intoxicating. Brandon thought he was burying me under a mountain of public shame. He did not realize he was just handing me a shovel. They needed the world to believe I was a ruthless, calculating monster who cared only about money. I was perfectly willing to let them hold on to that belief for just a little while longer. The louder Brandon yelled his lies today, the more devastating the silence would be when I finally unveiled the reality of my resources. By 48 hours into the smear campaign, the digital poison began seeping into my physical reality. It is one thing to watch anonymous bots hurl fabricated insults across the internet. It is an entirely different kind of warfare when the lies start infecting the people you actually know. Jamal had mirrored my professional email accounts to a secure server, allowing me to monitor the incoming fallout without triggering any read receipts that Thomas could track. I sat at the kitchen island watching the dominoes fall exactly as my husband had orchestrated. The first blow came from a boutique investment firm I had consulted for over 3 years. The managing partner sent a brief, icy email terminating my contract effective immediately. He cited vague concerns regarding recent public controversies and the firm's strict moral clauses. 2 hours later, a former colleague from my risk assessment days forwarded me a link to Brandon's tabloid interview, attaching a single highly judgmental question mark. Even my extended family, distant relatives who only ever called during the holidays, were thoroughly manipulated. My old voicemail inbox, which Jamal was archiving, filled up with scathing messages. An aunt I had not seen since high school left a trembling, furious audio clip calling me an absolute disgrace to the family name. Thomas and Brandon were systematically burning my entire world to the ground. They were isolating me, ensuring that when the federal authorities finally came knocking, I would not have a single character witness left to stand in my defense. They wanted me destitute, hated, and completely alone. Rachel was pacing the length of the kitchen, her phone gripped tightly in her hand. She was reading the comment sections under the local business articles, her face flushed with absolute fury. "This is insane!" she erupted, throwing her phone onto the granite countertop. "They are calling you a parasite. They are saying you drained his accounts to buy designer bags, while his poor son struggled to keep his tech company afloat." "Melanie, I am not sitting here anymore. I am making a public statement. I am going to post the bank records Jamal found. Let everyone see that Thomas is a broke, fraudulent thief." She reached for her phone again, but I swiftly caught her wrist, holding it firmly. "Absolutely not," I commanded, my voice sharp and unyielding. "You will not post a single word." Rachel stared at me, tears of sheer frustration brimming in her eyes. "Why? Why are we letting them win? They are destroying your life. They are destroying a mirage." I corrected her gently, releasing her wrist. "I need you to understand the psychology of what is happening right now. Thomas is terrified. He is drowning in millions of dollars of fraudulent debt, and the federal authorities are closing in. This smear campaign is his desperate attempt to build a lifeboat out of my reputation. If you post those bank records now, you do not just clear my name, you warn him." I walked over to the window, looking out at the gray Brooklyn sky. "If Thomas knows we have access to his real financial data, he will panic. He will destroy evidence, shred documents, and likely flee the country before the FBI can build a solid case. We cannot just embarrass him online, Rachel. We have to trap him so deeply in his own lies that he can never escape." Jamal, who had been quietly monitoring the data streams, leaned back in his chair and nodded. She is right. Silence makes arrogant men careless. The less we react, the more confident they become. I turned away from the window, a renewed, dangerous energy coursing through my veins. The initial shock of the betrayal had completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, surgical precision. The time for gathering intelligence and absorbing their attacks was over. It was time to shift to the offensive. Jamal, I need a completely secure, untraceable line, I said, walking back to the kitchen island. No digital footprints, no routing data that can be intercepted. Jamal did not ask questions. He simply opened a locked drawer, pulled out a heavy encrypted satellite phone, and booted it up through a masked network protocol. He handed the dark device across the counter. The connection is blind. You have absolute privacy. I took the phone, my thumb hovering over the keypad. For the past 3 years, I had purposefully kept my late husband's wealth locked away behind impenetrable legal walls. I had lived a frugal, unassuming life, desperately hoping to find a man who valued my intellect over my assets. Thomas had exploited that vulnerability with breathtaking cruelty. He thought he had outsmarted a modest, defenseless woman. I was about to learn what happens when you attempt to sacrifice someone who possesses unlimited resources. I dialed a private, unlisted number I knew entirely by heart. The line clicked, and a deep, resonant voice answered on the first ring. David speaking. David was not just a wealth manager. He was a legal and financial apex predator, a man who navigated the treacherous waters of New York's elite billionaires with ruthless efficiency. Michael had trusted him implicitly, and for the past 3 years, David had faithfully guarded my $50 million trust, waiting for the day I finally decided to use it. David, it is Melanie, I said, my voice echoing with absolute authority. There was a brief pause on the line, followed by a subtle shift in his tone. Melanie. It has been quite some time. I trust the wedding went well. The marriage is over, I stated flatly, ignoring the irony of the question. My husband and his son are attempting to frame me for a multi-million-dollar federal securities fraud. They have launched a coordinated public smear campaign to destroy my credibility, and they believe I am currently sitting in a cheap motel completely destitute and terrified. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy, calculating. I could practically hear David shifting into his war room mentality. What do you need me to do? He asked, his voice entirely devoid of shock, replaced instead by a cold professional readiness. The dormant period is officially over, I commanded. I need you to bypass the standard holding protocols. Break the seals on the primary accounts. I am fully unlocking the $50 million trust. We are going hunting. The encrypted phone felt heavy in my hand as David's silence stretched across the secure line. He did not need me to explain the emotional betrayal or the psychological abuse. David was an apex predator in the world of high finance, a man who viewed human conflict entirely through the lens of leverage and liability. I had just handed him the ultimate hunting license, and his razor-sharp legal mind immediately shifted into absolute overdrive. We will need an impenetrable corporate structure. David stated, his voice a low, steady rumble of authority. A fresh Delaware limited liability company layered beneath a blind trust, headquartered in the Cayman Islands. It will provide a total blackout of your identity. Thomas will never see us coming until the jaws snap shut. I paced the length of Rachel's kitchen, my steps matching the relentless driving rhythm of my racing heart. I verbally authorized the transfer of the initial operational capital. We had $50 million fully unthawed and ready to deploy. I did not just want to throw money at the problem to make it disappear. I wanted to execute a flawless surgical financial strike that would leave my enemies completely paralyzed. Get the holding company registered by tomorrow morning. I instructed, my tone mirroring his clinical precision. Then I want you to start making phone calls. Jamal has compiled a comprehensive, highly detailed ledger of every single entity Thomas owes money to. The construction contractors he stiffed on his fake development projects, the private investors he defrauded with those hollow corporate bonds, the luxury leasing agencies currently hunting down his expensive sports cars. I want you to aggressively and quietly approach every single one of his desperate creditors. I want to own his debt. I want to own his entire world. David understood the assignment with terrifying clarity. He immediately mobilized his elite team of corporate associates, triggering a cascade of high-level banking protocols that had laid dormant for 3 years. While Thomas spent his evening drinking expensive whiskey in the penthouse, eagerly congratulating himself on successfully discarding his supposedly worthless wife, my financial general was actively building the war machine that would crush him. By the time the sun rose over the Brooklyn skyline the next morning, Vanguard Apex Holdings had been officially incorporated. It was a phantom entity, a ghost ship carrying $50 million in highly liquid capital, with my name completely erased from all public registries. As far as the financial world was concerned, a massive faceless private equity firm had just aggressively entered the Manhattan distressed debt market. Rachel and Jamal sat with me in their living room, watching the digital groundwork solidify. Jamal had established a secure encrypted dashboard that linked directly to David's firm, allowing us to watch the hunt unfold in real time. We were operating entirely from the shadows, invisible and utterly lethal. The first major target was the private syndicate of investors who held the $25 million in fraudulent corporate bonds Thomas had issued. These were wealthy, dangerous individuals who were currently furious that Thomas had defaulted on their initial maturity payouts. They were preparing to initiate aggressive, highly public litigation, but legal battles take years and drain massive amounts of capital in attorney fees. David approached their lead representative under the guise of Vanguard Apex Holdings. He offered them an immediate clean exit strategy. "We buy the defaulted bonds off your hands today for 70 cents on the dollar," David proposed through his proxy negotiators. "You walk away with guaranteed cash injected directly into your accounts, and we assume the absolute risk of tearing Thomas apart to recover the physical assets." For investors staring down the barrel of a total loss on a non-existent commercial development, it was a lifeline they simply could not refuse. The sheer scale of the capital we unleashed was a tidal wave that swept away all resistance. Within hours of the initial contact, the investors signed ironclad non-disclosure agreements, legally transferring their rights titles and legal claims directly to my anonymous holding company. While David negotiated with the heavy hitters, he deployed his ruthless junior partners to sweep up the smaller, lingering liabilities. They approached the angry contractors suing Vanguard Horizon Properties for unpaid labor, offering immediate cash settlements to purchase the mechanics' liens placed on Thomas's hollow real estate projects. They bought out the delinquent lease agreements on Brandon's luxury vehicles. They even targeted Brandon's fake tech startup, aggressively buying out the unpaid server hosting debt and the massive delinquent payroll tax liens. It was a masterclass in predatory finance. We were moving with breathtaking speed, quietly snapping up every single piece of toxic debt Thomas and Brandon had accumulated over the past 2 years. We were actively building a financial cage around them, welding the steel bars into place while they were completely blissfully oblivious. As I watched the red indicators on Jamal's dashboard turn bright green, signaling yet another successful debt acquisition, my secure burner phone lit up with a forwarded notification. Jamal had intercepted a digital communication from Thomas. He had sent an email to my old compromised address, playing the role of the tragic, helpless victim to absolute perfection. "Melanie," the email read, dripping with manufactured pathetic sorrow, "I hope you are safe at your sister's house. Brandon is completely out of control, and his lawyers are threatening to involve the police if you try to return to the penthouse. Please just lay low. I am trying to figure out a way to sneak you some cash for groceries, but my accounts are tied up in this legal mess. I miss you so much. Please be patient while I fix this." I read the message aloud to the room. Rachel let out a sharp, incredulous bark of laughter, shaking her head in sheer disgust. "He actually thinks you are sitting here in the dark, waiting for him to send you grocery money." I stared at the glowing screen, a cold, predatory satisfaction washing over my entire body. Thomas genuinely believed his smear campaign was working flawlessly. He believed I was cowering in absolute disgrace, entirely dependent on his false promises of salvation, too terrified to show my face in public. He thought he was playing a brilliant, flawless game of chess against a defenseless, easily manipulated opponent. He had absolutely no idea that while he was typing out pathetic lies about grocery money, I had just authorized the legal purchase of his entire financial existence. I was not hiding in disgrace. I was sitting in the shadows patiently sharpening the blade that would eventually sever his head from his fraudulent empire. The financial hunt was officially underway, and the prey was completely unaware that the ground beneath his feet already belonged to me. The secure dashboard on Jamal's monitor glowed with a steady stream of green confirmation signals, illuminating the dark kitchen with the undeniable proof of our absolute victory. Vanguard Apex Holdings was executing the debt acquisitions flawlessly. David and his elite legal team were systematically swallowing every toxic loan, unpaid vendor contract, and fraudulent corporate bond tied to my husband's failing empire. We were quietly locking all the financial exits. Just as David secured the final massive lien on Thomas's non-existent commercial development, the cloned inbox of my old personal phone chimed sharply through the room. It was a direct message from Thomas. I opened the text half expecting a thinly veiled threat or a demand for signed divorce papers. Instead, the words dripping from the screen were laced with a sickening manufactured sweetness. He wrote paragraphs of absolute fiction playing the role of the heartbroken, helpless husband to sheer perfection. He claimed his world was completely shattered without me in the penthouse. He spun a pathetic, elaborate narrative about how Brandon had gone entirely rogue, locking him out of his own corporate accounts and threatening to involve the authorities if I dared to show my face anywhere near Manhattan. "Please, my love," the message read. "You have to stay hidden at your sister's house. Brandon is out of control right now. He has hired vicious lawyers, and it is simply too legally dangerous for you to come back to the city. I am fighting him every single day, trying to fix this mess and get our life back. Just stay out of sight for your own safety." I read the words aloud to the kitchen. Rachel let out a harsh, bitter laugh from the stove, shaking her head at the sheer breathtaking audacity of the man. Jamal did not even look up from his routing protocols, merely scoffing at the transparent manipulation. Thomas was trying to play the tragic hero trapped in a tower, desperately trying to keep his supposedly destitute wife paralyzed with fear. The irony was staggering. He was warning me about a dangerous legal threat, completely unaware that the most dangerous entity in his entire existence was currently reading his text over a cup of dark roast coffee. He thought he was successfully isolating a terrified middle-class woman. He did not know that the mysterious, ruthless private equity firm currently ripping his fraudulent empire apart piece by piece was actually his legally wedded wife. Another message chimed in immediately after the first. "I miss you terribly, Melanie. I am trying to scrape together some cash from an old business associate to send you so you can buy food and basic necessities. Just promise me you will not talk to anyone or go online. The media is being so cruel with their rumors right now, and I want to protect you from seeing it." I was not trying to protect me from the media. He was trying to ensure I did not publicly contradict the massive smear campaign he and Brandon were actively funding. He needed me silent, compliant, and hidden away, so their scapegoat narrative could solidify flawlessly before the federal auditors arrived. The promise of scraping together grocery money was the ultimate insult, a psychological tactic designed to reinforce my supposed total dependence on him. He wanted me to feel grateful for the crumbs he was offering, completely blind to the fact that he was the one starving. I stared at the blinking cursor on the screen. Responding with anger would tip my hand and ruin the operation. Remaining completely silent might make him suspicious or force him to change his tactics prematurely. I needed to feed his massive, fragile ego. I needed him to feel absolutely secure in his dominance, so he would continue ignoring the massive financial sinkhole opening up directly beneath his designer shoes. I crafted the perfect, pathetic reply, channeling the exact persona he expected me to embody. "I am so scared, Thomas. I am staying inside just like you said. Please fix this. I do not have anything left without you." I hit send and watched the message vanish into the digital ether. It was a flawless performance of total submission. Within seconds, a read receipt triggered, followed by a swift, patronizing reply. "I will handle everything. Just trust me and stay hidden." I set the phone face down on the granite countertop, a cold, predatory smile touching my lips. Trust was the currency Thomas used to bankrupt his private investors, and it was the exact same currency he had tried to use to ruin my life. But the game had fundamentally changed. I was no longer the easy mark. I turned my attention back to Jamal's glowing dashboard. The final row of data finished compiling. David had just officially registered the transfer of Brandon's delinquent payroll tax liabilities to our holding company. The financial noose was officially pulled tight. We owned the debt on the penthouse. We owned the loans on the luxury vehicles. We owned the leverage on the stolen corporate bonds. I was now the sole absolute creditor to both my treacherous husband and my arrogant stepson. Every breath they took in that high-rise was now entirely funded by my grace. A grace that had officially run dry. Now it was just a matter of waiting for them to start kicking. The burner phone vibrated against the cold granite countertop the next morning, breaking the quiet focus of our digital war room. A new message from Thomas illuminated the screen. He wanted to meet. He did not suggest his usual upscale haunts in Manhattan, the dimly lit steakhouses, or the exclusive rooftop lounges. Instead, he dropped an address for a rundown off the beaten-path coffee shop deep in the industrial sector of Queens. His instructions were frantic and highly specific. He told me to take the subway to wear a hood and to make absolutely sure no one followed me. I dressed for the part with meticulous care. From my decoy suitcase, I pulled a faded oversized sweater and a pair of worn denim jeans. I skipped my makeup routine entirely, letting the natural exhaustion of the past few days show on my face, and tied my hair into a messy, defeated knot. Rachel looked me over, nodding with grim approval at the broken, destitute woman I portrayed in the mirror. Before I walked out the door, Jamal stopped me in the hallway. He handed me a tiny, matte black button. It was a military-grade audio transmitter. He pinned it discreetly beneath the collar of my sweater, ensuring a direct encrypted feed straight back to his secure servers. Every single word spoken today would be permanently archived. The coffee shop smelled of burnt grease and stale bleach. The neon open sign in the window flickered erratically, casting harsh, buzzing shadows across the cracked linoleum floor. I slid into a sticky vinyl booth at the very back of the diner, wrapping my hands around a chipped ceramic mug of black coffee. I hunched my shoulders and kept my eyes glued to the table, projecting an aura of pure, unadulterated fear. 10 minutes later, the bells above the glass door jingled sharply. Thomas stepped inside. He had clearly put immense effort into crafting his tragic costume. He wore an expensive trench coat, but the collar was popped haphazardly. His designer shirt was visibly wrinkled, and a carefully cultivated shadow of stubble covered his jawline. He looked frantically over his shoulder, playing the role of a hunted man before finally spotting me in the corner. He rushed over, sliding into the booth and immediately grabbing my hands across the tabletop. His palms were cold and damp with artificial sweat. He let out a shaky, dramatic breath, fixing his eyes on mine with a practiced look of absolute devastation. "Melanie," he whispered, his voice cracking with theatrical strain. "Thank God you are safe. I was so worried Brandon's lawyers had tracked you down." I forced my hands to tremble within his grip, widening my eyes to mirror the exact terror he expected to see. "I have been so scared, Thomas," I replied, my voice wavering perfectly. "What is happening? Why did we have to meet in a place like this? Why can I not just come home?" He squeezed my fingers tightly, closing his eyes for a brief second, as if fighting back a wave of immense, crushing pain. He leaned across the table, lowering his voice into a hushed, conspiratorial whisper. "Things are worse than I thought. Brandon's eviction stunt was just a distraction. I did not want to tell you this over the phone because I do not know who is listening, but we are in serious trouble. My real estate firm is under investigation." I let out a soft, rehearsed gasp, pulling my hands back just an inch to simulate shock. "An investigation by who?" "The FBI," he muttered aggressively, rubbing his temples to simulate a crippling migraine. "It is a complete witch hunt, Melanie. Some disgruntled former contractors filed false reports to the state board, and now the federal authorities are crawling all over my corporate accounts. They froze everything. It is just a minor clerical error, a stupid mistake by my accounting department regarding some commercial development bonds, but the feds are blowing it wildly out of proportion." Sitting across from him, listening to the smooth, practiced cadence of his lies, I felt a surge of absolute disgust. He was painting himself as the tragic victim of a bureaucratic misunderstanding, a noble businessman unfairly targeted by a ruthless government agency. He was carefully omitting the fact that the so-called clerical error was actually a $25 million theft. I was leaving out the part where he knowingly defrauded private investors and washed the cash through his son's fake tech company. "They are trying to ruin me," he continued, forcing a single perfectly timed tear to spill over his lower lash line. "They want to put me in a federal prison over a paperwork glitch. If they succeed, they will seize everything. We will lose the penthouse, the cars, our entire future together. I am terrified, Melanie. I have never been so scared in my entire life. I do not know how to fix this without losing everything we built." I stared at the tear tracking down his cheek. It was a masterful sociopathic performance. He was actively setting the stage, priming my emotions, and preparing my mind to make the ultimate sacrifice to save our supposed love. He genuinely believed he had me trapped in his psychological web, completely isolated from the world, and utterly dependent on him for salvation. He thought he was looking at a broken, naive woman who would do absolutely anything to protect her husband. He had no idea that the microphone resting against my collarbone was already capturing every single syllable of his deceptive, treacherous confession. He was digging his own grave right in front of me, and I was perfectly willing to sit there and hand him a bigger shovel. He leaned across the sticky vinyl table, the flickering neon light casting deep shadows over his face. The tragic victim routine was fading, replaced by the calculating gaze of a cornered predator. He took a deep breath, reaching out to cup my cheek. I forced myself not to flinch at his touch. He wanted to project warmth and intimacy, but his eyes were entirely devoid of empathy. He was sizing me up, evaluating whether his psychological conditioning had taken root. "Melanie, you have to understand how the federal government works," he murmured, his thumb stroking my skin with manufactured tenderness. "They do not care about the truth. They only care about what is on paper. And right now, the paper says you are the chief executive officer of the holding company under investigation." I let out a sharp, perfectly rehearsed gasp. I pulled my hands back, pressing them against my chest as if I were trying to hold my heart in place. "What are you talking about? I am not a CEO. Thomas, I am a risk assessor. I do not run your companies." "Remember those marital tax forms we signed right before the wedding?" he said smoothly, completely unfazed by my feigned panic. The lawyers slipped the corporate incorporation documents into the stack by mistake. It was a massive oversight, but the state processed them. Legally, you are the head of the entity they are auditing. If I try to fight it and claim it was a mistake, they will freeze all our assets immediately. We will lose everything. The penthouse, the cars, our entire future together. The sheer audacity of his lie was breathtaking. He was framing a premeditated federal trap as a simple bureaucratic oversight. He was looking me dead in the eyes and asking me to believe that a multi-million-dollar corporate structuring was an accidental paper shuffle. He was relying on the assumption that I was legally illiterate and easily cowed by federal threats. I let my lower lip tremble, injecting exactly the right amount of desperation into my voice. "Thomas, they could send me to prison. I could go to jail for this." He lunged forward, grabbing both of my hands in a bruising grip. "No one is going to prison," he insisted fiercely. "I swear to you on my life, Melanie. I have connections, powerful connections. I know exactly who the judge is on this circuit." He then proceeded to do the most foolish thing a criminal can possibly do. He got specific. He named the federal judge. He detailed exactly how he planned to route a massive bribe through a shadow political action committee to ensure the judge handled the case favorably. He laid out the mechanics of the payout, explaining the offshore accounts he intended to use to wash the bribe money before it reached the judge's associates. "I will make sure you only get a slap on the wrist," he promised, his voice dripping with urgent sincerity. "A fine and maybe a few months of unsupervised probation. That is it. You take this tiny hit for the team, and I save our entire empire. I will owe you my life, Melanie. You will be my absolute savior." How was asking me to become a convicted felon so he could continue leasing sports cars and drinking expensive whiskey. He wanted me to carry the permanent life-ruining stigma of a federal financial crime to shield his fragile ego and his fraudulent bank accounts. He framed my destruction as the ultimate act of marital devotion. Then came the ultimate unforgivable insult. Thomas reached inside his wrinkled designer trench coat and pulled out a thick, unmarked manila envelope. He slid it across the grimy table, shielding it from the view of the bored waitress wiping down the counter across the room. "I scraped this together from a private safe," he whispered, pushing the heavy package into my hands. "It is $10,000 in untraceable cash. Take it. Use it to pay Rachel for rent. Buy yourself whatever you need to stay comfortable while you hide out. Just keep your head down and let me handle the legal strategy." $10,000. He believed that was the exact market value of a woman's freedom. He thought 10 grand was enough to purchase my silence, my compliance, and my complete destruction. I looked down at the envelope, contrasting this pathetic stack of dirty money against the $50 million of untraceable capital my wealth manager had actively deployed to ruin him. He was tossing me pennies while I was currently buying the bank that owned his mortgage. I picked up the envelope with trembling fingers, clutching it to my chest like it was a holy relic. I looked up at him with wide, terrified, completely devoted eyes. "I am so scared, Thomas. But I love you. I want to save our future. I just need a day to process all of this." The visible relief that washed over his face was absolutely nauseating. He genuinely thought he had won. He thought he had successfully manipulated a desperate, destitute woman into falling on her own sword. "Take all the time you need today," he said, standing up from the booth. He leaned down and pressed a firm, lingering kiss to my forehead. "Gregory will draft the admission of guilt. We will meet at his office for a formal mediation with Brandon later this week. You just sign the papers and I will take care of the rest. I love you, Melanie." He turned and walked out of the coffee shop, the bells jingling cheerfully behind him. He strutted out into the rain with the arrogant swagger of a man who firmly believed he had just outsmarted the federal government and his own wife in one brilliant stroke. I sat alone in the sticky vinyl booth for exactly 3 minutes, my eyes fixed on the rain washing down the storefront window. Once I was absolutely certain his car had turned the corner, I reached up and tapped the collar of my oversized sweater. "Jamal," I said, dropping the terrified victim persona instantly. My voice was sharp, professional, and entirely devoid of fear. "Tell me the transmitter is clear." Jamal's voice crackled to life through the secure earpiece hidden beneath my hair. It was vibrating with dark, predatory triumph. "Crystal clear, Melanie. We have the admission of the shell company setup. We have the explicit intent to pervert justice. And we have the specific recorded plan to bribe a federal judge. He just gift-wrapped his own federal indictment." I stood up from the booth. I looked down at the manila envelope sitting next to my cold, untouched coffee. I did not take it. I left his pathetic $10,000 sitting right there on the cracked linoleum table for the waitress to find. I pulled my hood up and walked out into the freezing Queen's rain, feeling a surge of absolute invincible power. Thomas thought he had backed me into a corner, forcing me to choose between a fake eviction and a federal prison sentence. He had no idea that while he was drafting my fake confession, my elite financial team had just officially foreclosed on his entire reality. The trap was set, the evidence was secured, and the only thing left to do was watch him walk blindly into the execution chamber. 3 days passed in a tense, highly calculated silence. I spent those 72 hours sequestered in Rachel's Brooklyn brownstone, monitoring the digital dashboard, as David finalized the absolute acquisition of Thomas's financial ruin. Every toxic loan, every defaulted bond, every fraudulent liability was now securely locked within the vault of my anonymous holding company. I held the kill switch. All I needed was for them to firmly plant themselves in the blast radius. Thursday morning arrived with crisp, biting clarity. The supposed mediation regarding Brandon's frivolous $100,000 lawsuit was scheduled for 10 o'clock sharp at Gregory's law firm. I chose my wardrobe with the precision of a stage actor. I wore a faded gray blazer, a simple cotton blouse, and practical scuffed flats. I deliberately skipped my morning coffee to ensure my hands would carry a slight nervous tremor, and I applied just enough matte powder to make my complexion appear pale and entirely drained of hope. Gregory's office was located on the 42nd floor of a gleaming glass skyscraper in Midtown Manhattan. It was a space designed entirely to intimidate. The lobby featured imported Italian marble floors, towering abstract sculptures, and floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a dizzying panoramic view of the city skyline. It was the architectural embodiment of predatory legal power, meant to make the opposing party feel incredibly small the moment they stepped off the elevator. I approached the sleek reception desk, giving my name with a soft, manufactured stutter. The receptionist, a woman with a practiced icy smile, did not offer me a seat. She simply picked up a desk phone, murmured a few words, and gestured toward a heavy set of frosted glass doors at the end of a long, sterile corridor. I walked down the hallway, keeping my shoulders hunched and my gaze directed at the floor. I was preparing my mind to absorb the sheer weight of their psychological warfare. I pushed open the heavy conference room door. The space was cavernous and overwhelmingly opulent. A massive polished mahogany table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by high-backed leather executive chairs. Brandon was already seated at the head of the table. He was leaning back with his arms casually crossed behind his head, practically radiating a sickening, unearned arrogance. Gregory stood beside him, clutching a leather binder, attempting to project the aura of a high-powered legal shark, despite his poorly tailored suit. Thomas was sitting in the far corner of the room, completely separated from the table. He had his head bowed, his hands clasped tightly together between his knees. He did not look up when I entered. He was playing the role of the devastated, broken-hearted husband who simply could not bear to participate in the legal execution of his wife. It was a cowardly, pathetic performance designed to distance himself from the extortion taking place. "Take a seat," Gregory commanded, bypassing any professional greeting. He gestured sharply to a lone, rigid wooden chair positioned on the opposite side of the massive mahogany table. I walked forward slowly, clutching my cheap handbag tightly against my chest. I sat down, keeping my eyes wide and darting nervously between Brandon and the lawyer. I let a small, visibly shaky breath escape my lips. "We are not here to negotiate," Brandon stated, dropping his casual posture and leaning aggressively across the table. He glared at me with absolute contempt. "You are not walking out of this building until we settle exactly how you are going to pay for what you did to my father." I opened my mouth, pretending to search for words, but Gregory immediately cut me off. He unclasped his leather binder and pulled out a stack of dense, heavily flagged legal documents. It was nearly 2 inches thick. He did not hand it to me gently. He forcefully slid the entire stack across the polished mahogany surface. The heavy paper hit the edge of my space with a dull, authoritative thud. "Right, there are two distinct legal settlements," Gregory said, his voice dropping into a harsh, commanding rhythm. "The first is a finalized, uncontested divorce decree. It outlines a complete and total waiver of any and all marital assets. You are legally relinquishing any claim to the penthouse, the vehicles, and any capital associated with Vanguard Horizon Properties. It also includes an ironclad non-disclosure agreement regarding your time spent with Thomas." I stared down at the documents, my hands gripping the edge of the table to maintain the illusion of sheer terror. "And the second document?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Gregory smiled, a predatory, merciless curling of his lips. "The second document is your formal written admission of guilt. It is a legally binding affidavit, explicitly detailing your role as the primary architect of the financial discrepancies currently being investigated by the federal authorities. It clearly states that you acted alone, utilizing your position as chief executive officer of the holding company to misappropriate investor funds without Thomas's knowledge." Brandon slammed his hand down flat on the table, the sharp crack echoing loudly in the cavernous room. "You sign every single page right now," he demanded, his voice thick with vicious authority. "You sign the divorce papers and you sign the federal confession." I looked at Brandon, letting a single perfectly timed tear pool in the corner of my eye. "And if I do not sign them?" "If you refuse to sign," Gregory intervened, leaning over the table so his face was just inches from mine, "I will personally walk your name, your address, and your corporate signature directly into the local FBI field office today. We will hand them the full digital trail linking you to the stolen bonds. You will be indicted, arrested, and held without bail by tomorrow morning." Brandon picked up the threat without missing a single beat. "My dad offered you a way out," he sneered, pointing a finger directly at my face. He offered to use his connections to get you a plea deal and probation. But if you walk out of this room without signing those papers, we pull that offer off the table. You will face the maximum federal penalty. You will spend the next 20 years in a maximum security penitentiary, and when you finally get out, you will be a convicted felon with absolutely nothing. You will be permanently homeless, completely unemployable, and entirely destroyed. I looked over at Thomas in the corner of the room. He still had his head bowed, playing the silent, suffering casualty of a broken marriage. I was fully authorizing his son and his lawyer to terrorize me into a federal prison sentence so he could keep driving his leased sports cars. I turned my gaze back to the thick stack of papers sitting in front of me. They wanted me to sign my entire life away. They demanded I take the fall for a massive financial crime, completely certain that I was a helpless, isolated woman with absolutely zero leverage. I stared at the signature line on the fraudulent confession, the trap they had so meticulously built, completely ready to spring shut. The heavy silver pen felt cold and foreign in my trembling hand. I held it awkwardly above the signature line of the federal confession, letting the tip hover just millimeters from the pristine white paper. The silence in the cavernous conference room was thick, suffocating, and entirely manufactured by the three men who believed they held my life in their hands. From the far corner of the room, Thomas let out a pathetic, muffled sob. He remained slumped in his leather chair, his face buried deep within his palms. He was peeking through the gaps in his fingers, watching me intently to ensure his psychological conditioning was holding firm. "I am so sorry," Melanie. Thomas whimpered, his voice carrying the perfect pitch of a broken, defeated man. "I tried to stop them. I really did. But Brandon has all the power now. If you do not sign those papers, they are going to take everything from us. Please just do what they ask. It is the only way we can survive this." I kept my eyes glued to the table, forcing a small, ragged gasp to escape my lips. His performance was stomach-churning. He was actively encouraging me to sign a document that would send me to federal prison for 20 years, and he was framing it as an act of marital survival. Brandon let out a sharp, barking laugh that shattered the quiet of the room. He pushed himself away from the mahogany table and began to pace across the imported carpet, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his tailored suit. "Look at him," Brandon sneered, pointing a mocking finger at his own father. "He is still trying to play the nice guy. But let us be brutally honest here, Melanie. You are never going to survive in our world. You are a joke. You have always been a joke." I looked up at my stepson, letting a perfect mask of wide-eyed terror wash over my face. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice cracking precisely on the last syllable. Brandon stopped pacing and leaned his hands flat on the table, bringing his face uncomfortably close to mine. He smiled, a wide, vicious grin that revealed the absolute rot in his character. "Because you were the perfect mark," he stated, his voice dripping with pure, unadulterated arrogance. "Did you honestly think my father married you for love? Did you think a man who builds skyscrapers and drives Italian sports cars actually wanted a woman who clips coupons and buys her clothes off the clearance rack? Look at you. You are sitting in a multi-million-dollar law firm, wearing a cheap faded blazer and scuffed shoes. You do not belong here. You never belonged here." Gregory, the sleazy attorney, chuckled from his seat. He leaned back, lacing his fingers together over his stomach, completely reveling in the cruelty of the moment. "We needed a scapegoat," Gregory explained, speaking to me with the slow, condescending tone one might use with a dim-witted child. "The federal authorities have been auditing Vanguard Horizon Properties for 6 months. Thomas knew the walls were closing in on the $25 million bond deficit. He needed a clean, untraceable patsy to take the fall for the corporate restructuring. He needed someone with no criminal record, no powerful family connections, and most importantly, no financial resources to hire a defense team." Brandon picked up the thread without missing a beat, eager to brag about his own supposed brilliance. "You thought you were so smart," he mocked, shaking his head in sheer disbelief at my apparent stupidity. "You literally told my dad on your first date that you were an independent financial risk assessor. You analyze fraud for a living. Yet, you sat on our sofa drinking cheap wine and signed away your entire life without reading a single page of the corporate charter we slipped into your marital paperwork. You assessed corporate risk for a living, and you could not even assess the man sleeping in your own bed." The supreme irony of his statement was almost too delicious to bear. He was actively mocking my professional capabilities while standing waist-deep in a financial trap I had already permanently locked him inside. I felt the tiny military-grade microphone resting flush against my collarbone beneath my blouse. Jamal was listening to every single word of this glorious unforced confession from his secure server in Brooklyn. I let my shoulders slump forward, projecting the image of a woman completely crushed under the weight of her own foolishness. But the money, I stammered, looking frantically between the three men. The $25 million from the investors. I do not have it. The FBI will know I do not have it. Gregory waved his hand dismissively, his smugness radiating across the table. They will see exactly what we tell them to see. The digital trail shows you moving the funds through the Delaware holding company and washing them through Brandon's tech startup. By the time you officially vanished from the penthouse earlier this week, the cash was already gone. When we hand the FBI this signed confession, they will close the case. You will go to a federal penitentiary, and Thomas will walk away as the tragic betrayed victim of a masterful female con artist. And if you try to fight us in court, Brandon added, moving to stand directly behind my rigid wooden chair, we will drag this out until you are entirely bankrupt. Oh wait, my dad already emptied your pathetic little checking account. You literally do not have a single dime to your name. You cannot even afford a public defender. Thomas let out another loud theatrical sniffle from the corner. Just sign the papers, Melanie. I will make sure Gregory puts money in your commissary account when you are locked up. I promise you will not be completely forgotten. The sheer breathtaking audacity of the offer nearly caused me to break my character. He was offering to put spare change into a prison canteen account as compensation for destroying my entire existence. They were all so completely certain of their victory. They were high on the power of their own deception, laying out the exact mechanics of their federal crimes because they firmly believed I was a powerless, isolated casualty of their greed. Gregory reached across the table and tapped a manicured finger directly on the signature line of the criminal admission. Time is up, Melanie. He ordered, his voice hardening into a ruthless command. The federal agents are scheduled to raid the penthouse tomorrow morning. We need this wrapped up right now. Sign the divorce decree, sign the confession, or I make the phone call to the FBI field office and you leave this building in handcuffs today. I looked down at the heavy silver pen resting in my hand. I looked at the fraudulent documents designed to end my life. I had absorbed every insult. I had captured every detail of their criminal conspiracy on a secure audio feed. I had allowed them to gorge themselves on their own arrogance until they were completely bloated with false confidence. The psychological trap had served its purpose perfectly. There was absolutely nothing left for them to confess. I slowly lifted my head, letting the mask of wide-eyed terror slip away completely. I straightened my spine, rolling my shoulders back, as the posture of the frightened middle-class victim vanished into the cold, air-conditioned atmosphere of the room. I set the silver pen down gently on top of the blank signature line. I looked directly into Brandon's mocking eyes, and for the first time since I had walked into the building, I offered him a sharp, genuine smile. Brandon's mocking expression faltered for a fraction of a second, his brain completely failing to process the sudden, drastic shift in my demeanor. The terrified, trembling woman he thought he had successfully backed into a corner was entirely gone. In her place sat a perfectly composed professional who was looking at him not with fear, but with profound, almost clinical pity. Gregory noticed the change immediately. His sleazy, victorious smile vanished, replaced by an aggressive, irritated scowl. He reached out and tapped the fraudulent confession again, his voice rising into a sharp, threatening bark. What do you think you are smiling at? Pick up the pen and sign the document, Melanie. I am not playing games with you. I will make that call to the FBI right now. I did not reach for the pen. I kept my hands folded neatly on the mahogany table, my eyes locked dead onto the lawyer. Make the call, Gregory. I challenged, my voice a quiet, lethal blade cutting through the cavernous room. Tell the federal agents to come directly to this office. I am sure they will be absolutely fascinated by the fraudulent extortion scheme you are actively facilitating today. Thomas bolted upright from his chair in the far corner, his fake, pathetic sobbing instantly silenced. He stared at me, his face pale with sudden, unscripted panic. Melanie, what are you doing? He demanded. dropping the helpless victim act entirely. Just sign the papers before you ruin everything. Before Thomas could take another step toward the table, the heavy frosted glass doors of the conference room swung violently open. They did not just open, they were thrust apart with the kind of commanding absolute authority that immediately sucked all the oxygen out of the space. A man stepped into the room. He wore a custom-tailored charcoal suit that radiated immense quiet wealth, and he carried a sleek black leather briefcase. He moved with the silent, predatory grace of a great white shark entering a pool of wounded, bleeding fish. This was David. He was not just my wealth manager. He was one of the most ruthless, elite, and utterly terrifying financial attorneys in the entire city of New York. The atmosphere in the room changed so fast it gave me mental whiplash. David did not look at Thomas. He did not even glance at Brandon. His cold, calculating eyes locked directly onto Gregory. Gregory physically recoiled. The color drained from his face so rapidly he looked as though he might actually pass out on the imported carpet. He took a stumbling step backward, bumping hard into the edge of the conference table. He knew exactly who David was. Anyone who practiced corporate law in Manhattan knew David's reputation. He was the attorney billionaires called when they needed a massive financial problem completely surgically eradicated. He was a legal executioner, and he was currently standing in Gregory's mediocre rented office space. "Mr. Sterling," Gregory stammered, his voice cracking badly, completely devoid of the aggressive bravado he had used to threaten me just moments ago. "What are you doing here? We are in the middle of a private confidential mediation." David did not answer immediately. He walked slowly, deliberately around the massive mahogany table until he reached my rigid wooden chair. He reached down calmly, picked up the heavy silver pen I had placed on the table, and snapped the cap back on with a sharp, decisive click. He tossed it casually over his shoulder, letting it clatter uselessly into the far corner of the room. "There will be no mediation today." David stated, his voice a low, resonant rumble that demanded absolute, unquestioning submission. "And there will certainly be no signatures placed on these entirely fraudulent, highly illegal documents." David set his black leather briefcase flat on the center of the table. The metallic snap of the latches opening echoed through the silent room like a gunshot. Brandon, completely oblivious to the massive shift in power dynamics and too young to understand the danger he was in, puffed out his chest and took an aggressive step toward my attorney. "Hey," Brandon shouted, pointing a trembling, furious finger. "You cannot just barge in here. My dad is Thomas Vanguard. We have a legal agreement with her, and if she does not sign it, she is going to a federal prison for 20 years. David finally turned his head to look at Brandon. He looked at the arrogant 22-year-old the way one might look at a particularly irritating insect right before stepping on it. "Sit down and close your mouth," David commanded, not raising his voice a single decibel, yet conveying a threat so profound that Brandon instantly froze in his tracks. "Your father is a bankrupt con artist currently drowning in $25 million of stolen corporate bonds. And you are an unemployed accessory to federal money laundering. I suggest you take a seat before I decide to have you arrested before lunch." Thomas let out a strangled, breathless gasp from the back of the room. He was staring at David, his eyes darting frantically to me, the pieces of the puzzle finally horrifyingly clicking together in his mind. The woman he thought was a penniless, isolated target had just summoned the most terrifying legal predator in Manhattan directly to her side. He realized with crushing certainty that the terrified middle-class wife persona had been an absolute illusion. David reached into his briefcase and pulled out a pristine, thick stack of legal filings bound in heavy black covers. He did not slide them aggressively like Gregory had done. He placed them gently on the table, aligning the edges with meticulous, mocking precision. "Gregory," David said, turning his attention back to the trembling lawyer who was actively sweating through his cheap suit. "You have engaged in a coordinated effort to extort my client using fabricated criminal confessions and falsified eviction notices. You drafted a fake property transfer deed to terrorize a woman into signing away her rights. That is a swift, direct path to permanent disbarment, followed closely by a federal indictment for conspiracy to commit extortion." My client Gregory squeaked, raising his hands defensively, as if to ward off a physical blow. "I was just following my client's instructions." I had no idea about any stolen corporate bonds or any federal investigations. I was just handling a standard marital dispute. David smiled a cold, empty expression that did not reach his eyes. You are about to have a very thorough, extremely painful education in corporate liability and accessory charges. But first, we are going to correct the profound, catastrophic misunderstandings operating in this room regarding asset ownership and financial leverage. David placed his hand flat on the black binder. He looked at Thomas, who was visibly shaking in the corner, and then at Brandon, whose arrogance had finally evaporated into sheer panic. My attorney was preparing to deliver the killing blow, executing the trap we had spent the last 72 hours building in the shadows. David's fingers smoothly unclasped the heavy rings of the black binder. The sharp metallic snap echoed like a gavel striking wood, finalizing the shift in authority. He extracted a single crisp sheet of paper and slid it across the polished mahogany surface. It came to a stop exactly 1 inch from Gregory's trembling hands. Let us begin with this utterly comedic demand for $100,000 in spousal support. David stated, his voice a masterclass in corporate warfare. My client does not owe your client a single dime. In fact, if we are going to discuss financial obligations today, we are going to discuss the $15 million your clients currently owe her. Gregory stared down at the document. Whatever color remained in his face instantly drained away, leaving him looking sickly and entirely defeated. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically across the dense legal text. He tried to speak, but his vocal cords completely failed him. Brandon, entirely lacking the legal literacy to understand what was happening, slammed his hands on the table. What is he talking about? He demanded, looking from Gregory to David with aggressive confusion. She has 12 grand to her name. My dad already cleared her out. She does not have $15 million. David ignored the outburst completely. He reached back into his briefcase and produced a second, much thicker stack of certified financial filings. He did not hand these to Gregory. He fanned them out across the center of the table like a dealer presenting a winning hand at a high-stakes poker game. Over the past 72 hours, a private equity firm known as Vanguard Apex Holdings has been aggressively acquiring distressed debt on the secondary market. David explained, his tone conversational, yet laced with lethal precision. They moved with remarkable speed, specifically targeting high-risk liabilities associated with a failing real estate firm called Vanguard Horizon Properties. Thomas let out a choked, desperate noise from his corner chair. He gripped the armrest so tightly his knuckles turned stark white. He knew the name of his own company, and he knew exactly what distressed debt David was referring to. Vanguard Apex Holdings has successfully purchased the entirety of your financial ruin. Thomas. David continued, turning his gaze toward my husband for the very first time. They bought the 3 outstanding mortgages on your Manhattan penthouse, effectively halting the bank foreclosures scheduled for tomorrow morning. They purchased the mechanical liens placed on your non-existent commercial development. They acquired the delinquent leases on your Italian sports cars, and they bought out the staggering payroll tax liabilities suffocating your son's fraudulent tech startup. Brandon's aggressive posture faltered. He looked at his father, waiting for Thomas to deny the allegations. But Thomas was completely paralyzed, staring at the documents on the table with wide, horrified eyes. So some random equity firm bought our debt, Brandon scoffed, attempting to project a bravado he no longer felt. That happens all the time in business. We will just restructure the loans with them. You are still just a divorce lawyer trying to stall. David smiled, a cold, merciless expression that promised absolute destruction. Vanguard Apex Holdings is not a random equity firm, Brandon, and they have absolutely zero interest in restructuring your loans. David pulled one final document from the black binder. It was the heavily embossed incorporation charter for the anonymous holding company. The exact legal instrument Jamal and David had meticulously constructed over the weekend. He placed it directly in the center of the table, tapping his index finger against the designated line for the primary shareholder. Vanguard Apex Holdings was incorporated 3 days ago for the sole explicit purpose of liquidating your entire existence, David stated, his voice dropping into a low, terrifying register. It is a privately held entity, and it is funded entirely by a single silent backer. Gregory finally found his voice. He looked up from the documents, his eyes darting toward me with a profound, sudden realization of the catastrophic trap he had willingly walked into. Mr. Sterling Gregory whispered, his voice shaking violently. "Who is the backer?" David gestured smoothly in my direction, extending an open palm toward my rigid wooden chair. "My client Melanie is the sole proprietor and absolute controlling shareholder of Vanguard Apex Holdings," David announced, delivering the executioner's blow with flawless execution. "She is the private equity firm. She personally funded the $15 million debt acquisition. You do not hold the deed to that penthouse, Brandon. My client holds the primary mortgage. She holds the titles to your vehicles. She holds the absolute leverage over your fraudulent corporate bonds." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a massive structural collapse. Thomas slowly raised his head, his face a portrait of complete and utter devastation. The illusion of the wealthy, commanding real estate mogul was entirely shattered, leaving behind nothing but a broke, desperate con artist staring at his own financial execution. He looked at my faded blazer, my scuffed flats, and my messy hair, his mind frantically trying to reconcile the impoverished victim he thought he had manipulated with the ruthless corporate predator who had just legally purchased his soul. "You literally have nothing." David continued, driving the final nails into their respective coffins. "If you attempt to file those fraudulent divorce papers, or if you take one single step toward a federal field office with that fabricated criminal confession, my client will not just defend herself. She will instantly execute her right as your primary creditor. She will liquidate the penthouse today. She will repossess the vehicles today. She will hand the complete financial anatomy of your money laundering operation over to the Securities and Exchange Commission today." Gregory aggressively shoved the stack of divorce papers and the fake confession away from him, pushing them to the far edge of the table as if they were physically burning his hands. He was actively distancing himself from the extortion plot, desperate to save his own legal license. Brandon fell back into his leather chair, the arrogant sneer completely wiped from his face. His mouth opened and closed silently, his eyes darting wildly around the opulent conference room as the inescapable reality of his situation set in. The tech startup he had used as a personal piggy bank, the luxurious lifestyle he had flaunted, the unearned superiority he had wielded like a weapon. It was all entirely gone. It legally belonged to the very woman he had just spent 20 minutes mocking. The balance of power had not just shifted, it had been entirely rewritten. I sat quietly in my chair, the heavy silver pen sitting uselessly on the table in front of me. I had absorbed their insults, I had documented their crimes, and I had waited patiently for the exact right moment to strike. They thought they had backed a defenseless woman into a corner, completely unaware that I owned the entire building. I reached forward and pushed the heavy silver pen away. It rolled across the polished mahogany and came to a stop against the fraudulent confession they had tried to force down my throat. I stood up slowly, the scraping of my wooden chair echoing sharply in the dead silence of the conference room. I did not look at the floor anymore. I did not hunch my shoulders. I stood at my full height, meeting the terrified stares of the men who had spent the last week actively plotting my federal incarceration. I reached to my wrist and unclasped the cheap, scuffed watch. It was the final prop of the middle-class disguise I had worn since the day I met Thomas. I held it up for a fraction of a second before letting it drop from my fingers. It hit the hardwood floor with a hollow plastic clatter, effectively shattering the spell they thought they held over me. "You really thought you found the perfect victim?" I said, my voice ringing with a cold, absolute authority that made Gregory physically flinch. "You looked at my practical clothes and my modest checking account and saw a desperate, naive woman you could easily manipulate and discard. You assumed I was financially illiterate because I did not wear designer labels or brag about offshore accounts. But that is the fundamental difference between old wealth and cheap, fraudulent credit, Thomas. Real power does not need to scream for attention." Thomas tried to stand, his knees knocking against the edge of his leather chair. He raised his hands in a pathetic, trembling gesture of surrender. "Melanie, please," he choked out, his voice cracking with genuine terror now. "You have to understand, I was desperate. The investors were threatening me. I never wanted to hurt you. I love you. I can prove it. We can fix this together." I let out a sharp, merciless laugh that cut through his pathetic performance like a razor. You do not love me, Thomas. You love the illusion of your own superiority. You love leasing sports cars with stolen investor capital and pretending you are a titan of industry. I never needed a single penny from you, because I was never the struggling risk assessor you thought I was. I took a measured step toward the edge of the table, commanding the entire room. My late husband left me a blind trust worth exactly $50 million. $50 million in pristine, highly liquid, untraceable capital. I hid it because I wanted a partner with a shred of actual integrity. I wanted to build a life with someone who valued loyalty over leverage. Instead, I married a broke, desperate con artist who stole $12,000 from his own wife just to keep the lights on in his fake office. Brandon let out a strangled gasp, his face turning an alarming shade of gray. He looked at his father, the realization of their complete and total destruction finally overriding his immense arrogance. 50 million, Brandon whispered, his voice shaking uncontrollably. You picked a fight with someone worth $50 million. Are you completely out of your mind? I did not just pick a fight. Brandon, I corrected him, my gaze locking onto my stepson with surgical precision. He dragged you directly into a federal conspiracy. You helped him forge a property transfer deed. You helped him launder $25 million of stolen corporate bonds through your fake tech startup. You sat in this room and actively tried to extort a confession out of me. You are not a hotshot tech CEO. You are a highly documented accessory to massive financial fraud, and I own every single piece of debt holding your fragile, pathetic life together. The panic in the room instantly mutated into a violent, chaotic implosion. The unified front Thomas and Brandon had presented shattered into a million jagged pieces. You told me she was broke, Brandon screamed, launching himself out of his chair and turning fiercely on his father. You told me she was just some middle-class nobody we could use to hide the money. You told me the eviction would solve everything. You dragged me into this. My entire startup is in my name. The feds are going to come after me. Thomas completely lost whatever shred of composure he had left. His face flushed a violent crimson as he screamed right back at his son. Do not you dare blame this on me, you ungrateful brat. I bought you that startup. I paid for your cars. I kept you out of the gutter. You were perfectly happy spending the investor money when it was flowing into your accounts. You loved playing the rich executive. You signed the transfer documents. Brandon grabbed the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning white as he leaned toward his father, spitting pure venom. Because you said it would protect us. You said framing her was the only way to keep the Securities and Exchange Commission off our backs. You set her up. You made me print out that fake eviction notice. You are the one who stole the $25 million. I am not going to prison for your sloppy, pathetic real estate scams. I will tell the FBI everything. I will testify against you. I will throw you right under the bus with me, Thomas roared, spit flying from his lips as he pointed a shaking finger at his own flesh and blood. I have the receipts, Brandon. I know exactly what you spent that washed money on. You are just as guilty as I am. You think you can walk away from this clean? You are drowning right next to me. They were tearing each other apart. The loyalty they had weaponized against me was completely non-existent between them. They were like two rabid dogs locked in a cage, viciously turning on each other the absolute second the trap was sprung. Gregory pressed himself flat against the far wall of the conference room, desperately clutching his briefcase, looking frantically at the heavy glass doors, as if calculating his chances of sprinting to the elevators without David stopping him. I stood back and watched them scream, watched them hurl blame and threats across the very same table where they had planned to end my life just 20 minutes ago. Their arrogant gloating had been completely silenced, replaced by the raw, ugly sound of absolute panic. They were bankrupt frauds stripped of their designer masks, exposed to the harsh, unforgiving light of their own catastrophic failures. I looked at David, who was watching the meltdown with an expression of mild, detached amusement. He gave me a single slow nod of profound respect. The financial execution was complete, the illusion was dead, and the true reckoning was only just beginning. I watched them unravel for exactly 2 more minutes. Brandon was backed against the mahogany table, his chest heaving as he screamed at his father. Thomas was sobbing genuinely, now the reality of his complete financial annihilation crushing whatever remained of his fragile ego. Gregory had managed to inch closer to the door, his hands trembling as he clutched his briefcase, desperately hoping he could slip out unnoticed. He reached for the heavy brass handle, but before his sweaty fingers could even make contact, the frosted glass doors swung open one final time. Jamal stepped into the room. He did not wear a tailored designer suit like David or Gregory. He wore a simple, sharp tactical jacket, and his posture was absolute granite. Behind him stood 4 federal agents wearing dark windbreakers with prominent letters stamped across their chests. Gregory froze completely, his briefcase slipping from his grip and hitting the carpet with a dull thud. Thomas choked on his own breath, his eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated terror as the agents moved into the room with practiced, overwhelming authority. Brandon practically collapsed against the table, all the fight draining entirely out of his body. Jamal walked straight past the trembling lawyer and stood right beside David. He reached into his pocket and placed a small matte black audio transmitter directly onto the polished mahogany surface. He then set down a thick encrypted flash drive right next to it. "Special Agents," Jamal said, his voice ringing with absolute unwavering clarity. "On this drive you will find the complete, unaltered digital footprint of a $25 million money laundering operation orchestrated by Vanguard Horizon Properties and washed through Apex Dynamic Solutions. You will also find a pristine time-stamped audio recording captured less than 72 hours ago. In it, you will clearly hear Thomas explicitly detailing his intent to commit federal fraud, his deliberate plan to extort my sister-in-law, and his highly specific premeditated strategy to bribe a sitting federal judge." The lead agent stepped forward, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. Thomas did not fight. He simply dropped to his knees on the imported rug, weeping uncontrollably, as the agent secured his wrists tightly behind his back. The man who had spent months masquerading as a brilliant, untouchable real estate titan was now nothing more than a broken, pathetic criminal sobbing on the floor. Brandon tried to run, a sudden burst of panicked adrenaline fueling his cowardly escape attempt. He barely made it 2 steps before 2 agents pinned him effortlessly against the conference table. They slapped the cuffs on him while he sobbed loudly, aggressively, begging for a plea deal and screaming that his father forced him to do everything. Their absolute lack of loyalty to each other was on full display until the very bitter end. David turned his attention to Gregory, who was pressed flat against the wall, hyperventilating. "Your office is now an active crime scene," David stated calmly, his voice a lethal whisper. "The State Bar Association has already received the documents proving your active participation in a coordinated extortion plot. You will never practice law in this city again, Gregory. You are completely finished." I stood quietly and watched as the agents dragged my husband and my stepson out of the opulent conference room. They walked them past the terrified receptionist, past the towering abstract sculptures, and straight into the waiting elevators in absolute, highly public disgrace. David turned to me, nodding slowly as the heavy glass doors closed behind the authorities. "The penthouse keys have already been delivered to your sister's house," David stated, adjusting his cuffs with perfect composure. "The deed is fully secured in your name. Vanguard Horizon is officially liquidated. The board is clear." I thanked David for his flawless execution and walked out of the building with Jamal stepping into the crisp Manhattan air. The storm had finally passed, leaving the city streets clean and bright. 3 weeks later, the intense media frenzy surrounding the massive financial bust had mostly settled into quiet, steady legal proceedings. Thomas and Brandon were sitting in federal custody, completely denied bail, due to the overwhelming flight risks and the severity of the evidence against them. They were facing decades in prison, and their high-priced defense attorneys had already abandoned them when the retainer checks bounced. Gregory had been swiftly disbarred and was currently fighting his own conspiracy charges. The penthouse, which had once been a suffocating cage of lies and manipulation, was now entirely mine. I had brought in a professional crew to strip away every single trace of Thomas and Brandon. The tacky designer furniture, the expensive whiskey collections, the pretentious artwork, it was all completely removed and donated or sold. I replaced it with pieces that brought me genuine peace. Comfortable sofas, vibrant plants, and art that actually meant something to me. The space was no longer a stage for a fake billionaire. It was a fortress of my own making. I thought about Michael, my late husband, who had left me the $50 million trust. He had wanted me to be safe, to be protected from a world that often preyed on vulnerability. He had given me a financial shield, but the resilience to wield it had to come from within. Thomas had tried to use my perceived vulnerability to destroy me, assuming my modest exterior meant I possessed a weak, easily conquered mind. He fundamentally misunderstood that the quietest people in the room are often the ones calculating the most dangerous moves. I stood on the massive terrace overlooking the glittering New York skyline. The evening air was warm, and the city below hummed with endless energy. The heavy glass doors slid open behind me, and Rachel stepped out onto the terrace carrying a bottle of vintage red wine. Jamal followed closely behind her, holding 3 crystal glasses. They walked over to the edge of the terrace and stood beside me, looking out over the sprawling city. We had navigated a treacherous, highly calculated war, and we had emerged completely victorious. Rachel poured the wine, handing a glass to Jamal and then to me. "To the absolute worst honeymoon in history," Rachel joked, a bright, genuine smile illuminating her face. I raised my glass, the crystal catching the ambient light of the skyline. "No," I corrected her softly, feeling a profound, unshakable sense of peace settling deep within my bones. "To the ultimate freedom." We clinked our glasses together, the clear, ringing sound echoing across the terrace. I took a sip of the rich wine, savoring the taste of absolute independence. I had hidden my wealth to protect myself from greedy, opportunistic men, but I had learned a much more valuable lesson. True power is not just about the money you hold in the bank. It is about the unyielding strength of your character, the fierce loyalty of the people who actually love you, and the absolute certainty that no one will ever manipulate your reality again. As we finally bring this multi-segment dramatic journey to a close today, Melanie's story leaves us with a profound truth about where real power actually resides. When we craft these narratives, we often look for explosive confrontations, but the most satisfying victories come from quiet, strategic patience. Melanie didn't need to raise her voice or throw tantrums when her world was supposedly collapsing. Instead, she allowed Thomas and Brandon's blinding arrogance to become the very weapon that dismantled their entire facade. The core lesson here is about the impenetrable strength of inner independence. It is easy to be manipulated when we seek validation from those who only view us as assets or stepping stones. Melanie stripped away that vulnerability by knowing exactly what she was worth, long before the $50 million even factored into the equation. She proved that true resilience isn't just about surviving betrayal, it's about holding your ground and letting toxic people systematically build their own traps. In life, much like in a carefully structured script, the antagonists often write their own downfalls if you simply give them enough silence to fill with their lies. Melanie's ultimate triumph wasn't the penthouse or the money. It was the unshakable certainty that no one would ever control her reality again. She reclaimed her narrative step by calculated step, proving her immense emotional intelligence. What was your favorite twist in this story? And have you ever had to quietly outsmart someone who severely underestimated your strength? I would love to hear your unique experiences. Share your thoughts. Let me know what you think and leave a comment below. If this tale of reclaiming power resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more.